Good morning, everyone. Well, it's good morning for me. I have no idea what time it is for you, but welcome. I'm sitting on a very sunny morning. Amazingly, we had good snow cover for Christmas, and the last 24 hours it's all melted, and then it'll come back again. I'm going to talk to you really in three parts today. The first will be continuing the Sermon on the Mount, and then I want to talk about conversion and particularly what's happening in the Islamic world. And finally, I want to say something about Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation and what it's doing in America at least, and hopefully elsewhere too. So that's the menu, so to speak. For those of you who are new to this podcast, and I hope there are at least some of you, given the growth rate, I think that must be true. I'm a retired professor of biochemistry and pediatrics who has spent his times, at least since the 90s, a lot of time talking to students in particular and doctors as well about issues of ethics, culture, faith, and public policy. That's been an incredible journey for me and a very, very enjoyable one. So let's get started with today's today's comments on the Sermon on the Mount, which has been central to my life. I can't say this too often. If you don't have a passage of Scripture that's central to your life, you're missing out on something very, very valuable. Add it to your prayers. Ask the Lord to give you a passage from Him to you, and then learn it by heart and use it regularly, and you will be blessed, and you'll repeat that maneuver many times. But there'll probably be one passage which becomes for you a sort of foundation stone for your living. Over Christmas, the joy for us was almost all our family, not all, but most of the 40 that we now are, got to see us at some point. So we had a marvellous Christmas, and everyone was doing well, pretty well at that point. Not everyone in the family is, but most are. We're blessed beyond belief in that respect. And of course, the reason for that is nothing to do with us. It's just to do with the fact that we obey the commandments about how you raise children. So I can only recommend it. Fathers in particular, you've got to spend time with your children so that they gather from you that you're passionate about the faith, passionate about the book, and you tell them the stories, and those stories become the reference bank for all the problems they face later on. In the early years, you don't even till they're 7, you don't try to tell them what it all means. They're like little, I don't know what the word I want, sponges. They take in it all, and then they start processing it afterwards. But you've got 7 years in which you can make sure no rubbish gets in and lots of good things do. That's your job. And wives, your main function here is you tend to do everything, but you have a huge function in keeping your husband on track. My wife would say, you ought to do that more often than not. She'd say, oh, by the way, I've added to your agenda for the next trip. That's an incredible function to make it happen. Sally did that all the way through. I would dream and not move. She turns dreams into actions and outcomes. Now, where we've got to on the Sermon on the Mount, very quickly for those of you who've not been following this sequence, you can go back and listen to the others. But this is Jesus's first public sermon that we have, and we don't have the sermon, we have the notes for the sermon. Fortunately, Matthew was good at it, and he's laying out the agenda. And it's astonishing how little we talk about it in church. Particularly if you come from sort of rigidly dispensational, you tend to miss out the bits that precede an understanding of what Christ did at Calvary. But Christ didn't jump in there, so we need to take this seriously. And what I maintain he's doing, largely under the influence of Martin Lloyd-Jones and John Stott and a few others, is he's laying out the Christian character and how it's formed. Because conversion is just the beginning. It's the moment of being set free at one level, but we'll come to that in a later part of the talk this morning. But he's saying this is how you are to understand yourself and your role in the world. We are always going to be struggling. We are not set free in this world entirely. Dependency is what we have to learn, but dependency on Christ, not on ourselves. We are fallen creatures. Chesterton always said, surely the one Christian doctrine that nobody can deny is that we know better than we do. As he puts it beautifully in Island of the World. No, sorry, that's Michael O'Brien. Orthodoxy. He says, we know that we are the survivors of a colossal wreck that went down at the beginning of creation, when sin came in. But we have memories that go back, so to speak. We come into this world not like all the other animals, a bunch of instincts. We have instincts, but we're the only ones that has a metaphysical world. We know the nature of good and evil. We're not ignorant. Our problem is not ignorance, and therefore the university is not the solution, because the solution is not about knowledge. It's about the power to be more than you would be left to your own devices. And that's what Jesus is setting up. You begin every day by confession, really. First of all, facing the truth that yesterday was another day in which I failed to do the things I ought to have done, and I did a few things I ought not to have done. Lord, have mercy on me. I'm always doing this. And of course he does, which leads, that confession leads to forgiveness and sets you free to start being useful in the world by being obedient to Christ. And then he goes on and takes you through your outlook on the world. I mean, when people talk about slavery, you should say, yeah, everybody did it, but only Christians got rid of it. What is? Everybody did it. There isn't a culture that didn't have slavery. And the biggest slave marketeers over the whole of time were the Muslim world, closely followed by Africa, as far as I can see, where the most slaves are held today. But of course now the whole thing is being made even worse by the slavery of trafficking in people, a different sort of slavery, often sexual and dreadful. That's our world. Sad, but we've got to face reality. But it was the 18th century revival that turned getting rid of slavery into a crusade in England. As I often say, because it needs to be said, the bill that was paid once the British saw that they had to do this to get rid of slavery by attacking the lines of trade, the Royal Navy, the bill for that, the budget for that, was not paid off until the 21st century. So think about that. No other country has that record. So let's have a bit of truth here. It's awful, but it took all that time to go. In fact, in Britain, it was first effectively stopped within the island by Bishop Anselm in the 12th century, when the church was still powerful. And they said, look, it is evil. This is not something Christians should do. And there were no slaves in England. They were the first place to get rid of it at that level. Of course, people were trading in slaves, but they had to do it from Ireland or away. They couldn't have slaves in England. So the ideas that are all caught up in the Sermon on the Mount include the social ones, but they don't come first. The problem with the modern young is they think shouting about social justice is all they need to do. No, that's just self-indulgent hysterics most of the time. There's an intellectual structure to changing things, and it has to start always with what is the nature of reality, starting with your own, what are the solutions to the problems, and working your way through. And that turns you into somebody who looks at the other person, and even when they've done something nasty to you, the honest response is, there but for the grace of God go I. We could all do it. We could all have been Hitler. That's hard to accept, but it's true. So we got today, we went through mercy and seeing God and beginning to be a peacemaker in the world. And we get to the last one, which is repeated and which needs a bit more time than the others have had in some ways. So Jesus says, oh, and by the way, the last blessing I have for you is that you will be blessed by being persecuted. That's astonishing. You will be blessed by being persecuted. And in that way, that will be an addition to the kingdom of heaven. He goes on, repeats it, he says, when people revile you and say all sorts of awful things about you, falsely, for my name's sake, rejoice and be glad. Now, this is an amazing phenomenon. He's telling you to rejoice. We think of rejoicing as a feeling. He's telling us, no, it's a rational response to seeing the world as I see it and as you are to see it. Why? He gives two reasons for joy, not two feelings. He's not trying to make you feel good. He's wanting you to think more deeply so that that reality becomes rock in your life. You can't be touched. You're safe. And he says, you have joined the company of the martyrs and the prophets. And of course, you enter into my sufferings too, which are just about to happen in the human sense. But I think the greatest suffering that God allowed on himself was having to watch his creation and make all the mistakes it did. But he says, Paul puts it very clearly in a passage we often put the emphasis on us rather than the other way around. God is at work in your life, even in the blackest moments. That's what he says. He's allowed it, and it will be redeemed. In many cases, I don't think we will know what that redemption looks like until we get to be with him. And then we will be stunned to find out what grew out of what looks like incredible suffering. But it did. That's the way the world went. And the early church, of course, understood this much more clearly. And the modern church in places like Africa. I mean, I heard just the other day on YouTube somewhere, Tom Holland apparently went to Nigeria and witnessed the Christian Africans in the north of Nigeria actually risking their lives to tell the Fulani who were brutally killing them, the Muslims, that Jesus was a better way. And they didn't care that their lives were at risk. That was the early church too. You know, I don't think there's any question that Paul was first stopped in his tracks by watching the death of Stephen. Stephen was being stoned to death by the Jews, but he was looking up to heaven and seeing what was to come. Saul, as he was then, later to become Paul, had never seen anything like that. This man is transformed. We can't touch him. We've got to stop this. It will change our culture completely, which of course it did. That's what it's about. In the last part of my clinical practice, it was entirely devoted to children who the modern liberals wish to destroy before they're born. But it was the only clinic in my life where I often felt more like the patient, because those handicapped children brought a beauty and a breadth to life that could bring me to tears. A severely handicapped child makes or breaks a family. There's no halfway. Down syndrome kids tend to be the centre of the family. If they stay in the family, that's what happens. Because they preserve an innocence that we lack. That innocence comes through in all sorts of ways. There are one or two syndromes which I do not understand at all. I could not handle them in my family. I do not have the strength. One day I hope to understand that better. But I've certainly seen people handle what was given to them in terms of really dreadful burdens to bear with courage, dignity. They're great people. And it's brought into our lives by the handicapped if we will only open our eyes and look and see what role they have in the world. The fact that we're setting out to kill them will just make us even more narcissistically self-centered, useless people. it's when we get over the sense of self in that way that we can begin to live. Now, I've used this example before somewhere. I'm not sure whether it's on the podcast or talks, but it certainly bears repeating. One of the most beautiful examples of this that I've met in my life that made it, was really set out in a sentence or two. And it was a man called John Damascene, who was an Anglican priest in Rwanda when the war blew up. And his church was largely Hutu, and they were driven out by the Tutsi. And so they went to Zaire, where we were. He could have gone to Kenya and lived in relative comfort. But he said, no, I had to go with my flock. And they'd all lost everything. They were living under a blue United Nations tarpaulin, getting basic services of food, water, and medicine as well, often treated by UNHCR more like animals than people. My wife is the only person running camps who set about trying to rebuild a sense of human dignity, which she did brilliantly. But talking to John Damascene, he said, my church was growing in Rwanda. I thought I was doing well. But it wasn't until everything was taken away and I was living under a blue tarpaulin that I really learned to pray. And his blue tarpaulin was a place where people went for comfort, for soul food. And he said, I wouldn't have missed this for anything in the world. Can you imagine saying that? Can you imagine losing everything and only having what you could carry and being totally dependent upon the UN for a little while anyway? And saying, it's been the best experience, the most important experience. And one meets that every now and again. In the ancient world, they saw it more often because so many of them were martyrs. I mean, the martyrs in the early years were hundreds of thousands over time because the Romans were pretty brutal. They thought nothing of killing half the population when anywhere rose up against them. Utterly brutal and totally savage with respect to all the slaves who were used for sex or whatever else their masters wished. It was reading about that and writing about the Romans and then looking at what happened later that got to work on Tom Holland, and we'll come back to him in a bit. But if you haven't read Dominion, get the book. It's a good read, and he's not Christian when he's writing it. He is now. So this phenomenon that God works through suffering is important for us to think about. It's not something to immediately depress us. It's something to ask, Lord, what are you going to do with this? What is my role? And that prayer will be answered. And once you have changed the ownership, so to speak, things begin to be different. And your life can take some turns that you didn't expect. I went to Africa for the first time in 1987, against my will, because although I'd been privileged to be part of the group that wrote the definitive protocols for the treatment of severe malnutrition for all time, which are very counterintuitive, you would never arrive at them by anything other than science. But I knew I'd been watching for, by that time, nearly 10 years, and there's no evidence that it was working in Africa. And when missionaries said, we have a big problem, you have to come and help us, I didn't want to go because I wasn't arrogant enough to think that I could succeed where others had failed. So, but my family insisted that I use a sabbatical for that purpose. But what I learned on that trip was that you can't transfer technology without a cultural base. Technique requires cultural underpinnings. Particularly, you need certain understandings of nature and causation, which don't exist in a pagan culture. Paganism is the biggest religion in the history of the world, so to speak. The book of nature is how it works. And if you look at nature, you don't think that it's run by a God of love, do you? If half your children, which used to be the case, die before maturity in Africa, and you have the worst governments in the world, where's the God of love in that? No medical treatments. A witch doctor who will kill you for profit? No. He can't help on occasions if it suits him, but he can take both fees if he wishes. If one person's paying for your death and you're paying for your life, he can have both. That's the world, and paganism makes sense of it, but it's fatalistic, as is Islam. The will of Allah gets in the way of progress. That's why they don't win scientific prizes. The story that we inhabited had built into it ways of thinking that I should probably do a lot more talking about, and I'm not going to do it now except to say that I had to realize that that way of looking at the world had no space in it for nutrition education. There hasn't been a nutrition education program in Africa that worked if it depended upon changing the minds of the recipients. You could get rid of, say, iodine deficiency by adding it to the salt, and then that problem would disappear without their consent. But to change the whole idea of what it means to be a parent and what the nature of disease is, that's a big, big question. When a tribal group becomes Christian, take Britain as an example, it was effectively, the gospel got there very quickly, and then it faded out to the Celtic Rim because of all the tribal warfare that went on in Africa, in Europe, which was bloody in the extreme, worse than Rwanda, because it went on and on and on. It was always going on. Every year some raiders arrived from somewhere and caused mayhem and stole slaves and killed people. That was the norm. It wasn't until Gregory sent missionaries in around, well, I think he says 6th century. The date's gone from me at the moment. The gospel took root. Gregory was very smart. He told his missionaries, just live together and love one another for the first little while. And God protected them in a wonderful way. And I'm sure the pagan Brits watched these guys who cared about one another in a way that they had never seen before. So that when they had modelled the faith and then started preaching gospel, it spread very quickly. As far as the Scots stopped at the Scottish border, they were more recalcitrant. They took a little while longer. But it was centuries before the cultural and sociological and political implications of Christianity began to appear. And when they did start, actually, one of the greatest gifts of the world was one of the first gifts, because our greatest king was King Alfred. One of the first things he did was translate parts of the scripture into English, into the vernacular, whatever it was at that point. But above all else, he gave us the beginnings with his sons of common law, which the liberal elite hate, but which is the greatest strength of ordinary people. Because what Alfred said was, look, trying to run a justice system, even in a place as small as Britain, before there were roads and you only had horses, was a big job. So he had to send people off as judges to various places to deal with the hard cases. And he said, when you talk to the people, begin by asking them how they think about it, what they would say and what their problems are. And then lead them to build from that foundation onwards. And that's where common law arose. The idea that the best way to solve your problems is in court with a jury of your peers, not of clever people from law schools. They didn't appear till much later. But your peers. So when the general law came up, what the jury does is make you think about, should there be some exceptions, should there be some nuance? They said, well, yeah, that's what we would normally do, but in this case. Now, that doesn't change the law as a whole, but it sets a precedent that lawyers can then work on. We had the most stupid comment that I've heard for a long while from our Chief Justice not long ago, that nobody bothers about anything before 1960. It's all gone. That's unbelievable. It's turning the law just into a process that's run by current nostrums, which will be hopefully gone in 20 years. No, we have a long history that has led to the development of even powers to control those who rule over you. Kings, Magna Carta and all that came out of this. The idea that it could be that way. But that takes centuries to emerge. In Britain's case, 3 or 4. So don't expect to see wonderful social consequences to Christianity that quickly, unless there's more than paganism to work with to start. Paganism is still perfectly reasonable as a view of the world. Psalm 19, which C.S. Lewis called the most perfect poem ever written, begins by looking at the world and meditating on what it implies in a way that most pagans didn't, because they were too close to the earth. But they could do that. Look at Stonehenge, which was so incredibly constructed that on the solstice, the sun just appears at the right place to tell them this is the winter or the summer solstice. The calculations that went into that are incredible. We still don't understand. We're not always going forwards. It seems we went backwards many times and lost things on the way. But they had looked at nature with a care that we wouldn't be capable of in most cases. But our story took off in a different way, and what it leads to is the second half of the Psalm 19 is when he's celebrated creation, the psalmist turns and said, the law of the Lord is perfect. Now he starts looking inwards and looking at what the law has done, and he refers to the law as sweeter than the honeycomb. Without being a law-guided society, we end up with tyranny. So we need to hold on to that. I mean, the Americans, in my view, are right, thoughtful ones, to insist we are fundamentally a republic with a legal basis, and not a democracy in the sense of being able to say the people take over, scrub everything and change it overnight. That's what happens in Marxism. Marxism would be fine if we weren't sinners, but the evidence that we're sinners and can't even control our own natures is overwhelming. So that we'll come back to this later in one of the talks, that maybe in a separate talk by the time it's been edited. But it's important to realize that there's a long history to what we have, and we can destroy it easily. We're doing now what Russian liberals did at the beginning of the 20th century, and they set up a situation that ultimately created one of the worst governments that the world has ever seen. Now is probably worse. But the killers in the world have always been totalitarians in one sense or another. Power does corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Common law is one of the best ways of limiting absolute power. And the limitations are the key things. What the founders of the American state did was brilliant. I mean, essentially, by dividing the power between 3 factions, they created a constitution that's almost unworkable, which is what you need. They've got to work together to get anything done. Brilliant, brilliant. In a way, they were forced into it, of course, because they had landed in a huge area and they were spreading outwards. There was no way you could have a hierarchical approach. You could have some principles that people knew, and that was about it. They went off into the middle of nowhere. Everything had to be solved locally. Church had no hierarchy. It was a Protestant foundation, essentially congregational. But it exists to this day. In Europe and even in Canada, when things go wrong, people wait for the government to do something about it. In America, they tend to get together and start doing something themselves in case the government doesn't turn up, which it increasingly doesn't. That's a wonderful gift. that kind of coming together as a norm where they don't think about it, it's who we are. This all flows out from what we've been going through in the Sermon on the Mount up till now. Now, the next bit, sort of setting up for where we go next, he goes on to say what will happen if we are obedient. And he says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. We are to be salt and light to the world around us. Now, we miss the metaphor salt very easily, so I'll just fill in a little detail for you. He wasn't, of course, talking about the salt that you put on the table, which is pure sodium chloride. Well, not quite pure. A few little added ingredients so that it doesn't clog up the salt shaker. But essentially it's sodium chloride, which is very water-soluble. But in the ancient world, they found salty deposits of minerals, rock salt, which wasn't pure sodium chloride. There were lots of other junk in there. But there was enough salt in it to be used, but not so much for taste as for preservation. You would salt down fish and meat for the winter at the end of summer. And that took you through. So what he's saying is that Christians, my disciples, those who follow my instructions, will be salt in the world. They will preserve what is good. They will destroy what is evil. That's their job. But he then has a warning to us because we've become unsalty Christians to a large degree. That's hard for us to understand, but if you once realize he's talking about rock salt, the housewife would go at the appropriate time of year and buy a sack of salt, and she'd taste the top of it to see that it was salty. And the businessman would make sure that the top of all his sacks had the best salt on them. Now, even worse, sometimes if his sack was standing outside his shop, so to speak, and there was a sudden cloudburst, and a couple of inches of water around before he could do anything about it. When it dried out, it would look the same, but of course, sodium chloride being very water-soluble would have been leached out from the bottom of the sack. So the housewife would start preserving her meat or fish, a layer of fish, some salt, and so on. And after a while, she'd get tired of tasting it. But then was the time when she got to the salt that wasn't salty. So in a very short time, there would be a nasty smell. Did she blame the meat and fish, or did she blame the salt? She blamed the salt. Meat and fish decay if you don't stop it. That's their nature. Salt's nature is to stop that happening. But bad salt wouldn't do it. Interestingly, the Latin word for salt is salere, from which we get the word salary. You could be paid in salt. That's how valuable it was. But if you're a Christian, ask yourself, what evidence is there that I'm salty? I mean, many of the young people who are willing to go out and protest all the while, largely for psychological reasons, I think, but at least they're alive enough to say, well, that's wrong, even if they haven't thought it through and they need to get it sorted out. But what have we been doing? We've not been doing too well. So we go back to the beginning of the Beatitudes and work our way through again with repentance over why are we so lacking in salt? He goes on and said, you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do folk light a candle and then put a cover over it. No, they put it on a stand to give light to everybody in the house. That's what you are to be like. Look around. Have you brought salt and light into anyone else's life? If not, you missed out on a wonderful experience. Stop trying. Just ask, Lord, I'd like to do some more. Show me how. And you have a better life. So much for this week's section on the Sermon on the Mount. We will proceed next week somewhat faster because the rest of the sermon is an exposition of those first 12 verses in many ways.